Hey guys, Justin here. Today we're going to be taking a high-level look at gamma squeezes. This is going to be probably the first video in a few on gamma squeezes. They're pretty meaty, they have a lot to them. But today we're going to cover some of the basics. We're going to look at delta, we're going to look at gamma, we're going to look at hedging, and then finally we're going to end up with a example to kind of tie it all together. I will say, if you haven't, this is definitely a good time to watch the video on delta. I think it covers some really good foundational concepts that will definitely help with this video. So maybe if you're not too familiar with delta, or you know of it but you don't really know how it applies, definitely check that video out. I think it'll help, and then come back to this video. We're going to see how delta ties in with gamma. And then we're going to see how gamma squeezes are essentially just hedging on steroids. And then, like I said, we're going to wrap it up with a kind of like an example just to bring it all home. So one of the things that is lost in the market is the idea of delta direction. I think most people think that, calls have positive delta and puts have negative delta. Always. And this is true-ish, right? So like if this is Sally, our neighborhood trader, and if she purchases some calls, if she goes long on calls, or if she goes long on some puts, she does indeed have long delta. Sally buys puts. She is essentially buying delta from the market, so the delta is positive. The puts, when she buys them, she buys short delta from the market, and so she has negative delta. And one of the ways that we can determine which direction delta is asking ourselves, what does the value of my option do as the price of the asset increases? So because Sally's long call position's value increases when the stock price increases, her delta is positive. Conversely, if the stock price increases, well, Sally's puts decrease in value, so she has negative delta. But Sally's not the only one in this transaction, right? Like when Sally purchased those calls, an options dealer sold her those calls. And so the options dealer is now short calls that he sold to Sally. Conversely, when Sally purchased puts, the option dealer sold her those puts. And so this becomes important because it's the options dealer that is going to determine gamma squeezes. So we need to know, does the options dealer have short delta from selling those calls? Does he have long delta from selling those puts? Or did he buy those puts so he has long delta? Or did he buy those puts so he has short delta? Or is he the one that's long those calls so he has positive delta? So knowing the delta direction from the perspective of the options dealer is paramount. And this is why just knowing the options flow is insufficient for the majority of cases. We can assume if we see like a large out of the money call chunk that it's retail long or retail short, sure. But that is a profound assumption, and we're going to see that assumption can, if it's wrong, can lead to like the exact opposite view of what's happening in the market. And so deep dive stocks will always use the perspective of the options dealer in order to determine if a stock is in a gamma squeeze, if those out of the money calls are dealer long or dealer short, because it's the options dealer that is going to be the one that's hedging. So they're going to be the ones buying and selling shares contingent on how many and what type of options they have. Excuse me. So the options dealer's direction is what's paramount. And gamma squeezes occur when the options dealer has a net negative delta and gamma. Put gamma in parentheses because you can have a gamma squeeze in a positive delta environment, but it's rare. And gamma is directionless, right? So there is no positive or negative gamma. Gamma just describes the change or the rate of change of delta. The direction of change of delta is contingent on if delta is positive or negative, right? So a gamma squeeze we're going to see is contingent on gamma, but its formation or the initiation of the gamma squeeze is contingent on the delta. Once that delta becomes negative, then things start to get a little weird, right? And we're going to see that later. There's two main types of options in the derivatives market that can cause negative delta for the options dealer. And that is short calls. So if retail purchases a whole bunch of calls, me and you think that stock ABC is going to skyrocket tomorrow, so we purchase a whole bunch of calls. Well, that options dealer is selling those calls to us, so they're going to be taking on a whole bunch of short delta. And the same if I get a little, confident in my ability to predict the market and I start selling puts. Well, the people who are buying those puts are usually options dealers. And so because they're buying puts, they're taking on that short delta as well. And we're going to see that it's these two options that really have large impacts on the initiation and the propagation of gamma squeezes. So again, I just want to mention, if you haven't, definitely the time to check out the delta video, because delta can be viewed several different ways, and we're going to look at two of them here, which is the probability. So delta measures the probability of an option expiring in the money. And then later on, we're going to look at delta in terms of share equivalence, which is the idea that a delta represents how many shares an option behaves like. So let's look at probability first. So say Sally purchased some long calls. Sally's purchased those long calls from an options dealer. There he is. Say hi. And Sally's delta plus the options dealer's delta is equal to 0. What that means is they will always have equal but opposite deltas when it comes to looking at it probability-wise. So again, if Sally has a long call and the stock's price increases, well, Sally's delta increases towards +1. Conversely, the options dealer, his delta will decrease towards -1, right? So he has overall less delta, but he has a greater exposure to that delta. So if you go from -0.5 to -0.75, well, you have less delta in terms of you've decreased, right, from 0.5 to -0.5 negative. But the gamma of it all, and this is why gamma is directionless, is that your delta exposure has increased by 0.25. So we'll see how this plays out. I want to make sure that probability is understood. Because when we look at the market, we're not always going to have this video with us. We may not always have our notes with us. So conceptually understanding how delta works is going to pay handsome dividends in the future. So delta works by measuring the probability that the option will expire in the money, right? And it does this by the way of a distribution curve, which is right here on this screen. The area under the curve represents the probability of some event happening. So suppose we mark this line as if I'm over this line, I get $5, or if I'm to the right of the line, I get over $5. If I'm to the left of the line, I don't get any $5. Well, because the area to the left and the area to the right is equal, that means I have about a 50% chance of getting my $5. And that's how delta works. So in this case, because it's a 50% chance, delta would be 0.5. So knowing if delta shifts, so say when Sally's long call, or the stock that Sally has those long calls on increases in value, well, because the stock price is increasing and she has long calls, the probability that her calls will expire in the money increases. So that line shifts to the right. And that means she has more delta. And remember, because Sally has that positive delta, that means she has more positive delta. Whereas the options dealer, although he still has more delta again, he now has more negative delta. So he has decreased his delta in a sense, right? Like again, -0.5 to -0.75 is a decrease in delta, but he has a greater exposure to this delta because, well, 0.5 to 0, he has a 0.25 increase in delta exposure. So this probability curve will help when you're kind of eyeballing the market and not trying to figure out how these deltas might change in response to a changing stock price. And then this is why direction is so important, because in order to understand who is kind of taking on more of this delta exposure and in which direction, you have to know which direction or what type of delta the options dealer has. And again, because in this case, the options dealer has negative delta, when his delta increased, it went from, say, negative 0.5 to negative 0.75. Well, he has a greater delta exposure, even though he now technically has less delta. So let's look at an example of this just to kind of nail it home. Suppose Sally has a long call for $10. The stock's price is $5, right? So that maybe that puts her delta, or the probability that her options expire in the money, somewhere around 30%. So she has a delta of 0.3. So then the options dealer will have a delta of negative 0.3 because we know that these options are dealer long. Suppose the stock price increases to 9, a healthy, modest increase. Well, because Sally has a long call and the stock price increased, her delta increases because the probability of her options expiring in the money has increased. So now she has a greater probability that her options will expire in the money, so her delta, let's say, is 0.9. Well, the options dealer taking on the other side will be negative 0.9. So Sally has gained 0.6 long delta, and the options dealer has gained 0.6 short delta. That's a cool way to look at it. So knowing if the delta is long or delta is short can help you understand gamma squeezes, because this 0.6 long delta gain and this 0.6 short delta gain is gamma. And so this is why I mean gamma is directionless. Notice that it's in both cases 0 plus 0.6 delta, but it's the direction of the delta that tells us if it's long delta gain or short delta gain. And we're going to see when we get to the hedging that it's that key piece of information that allows us to identify gamma squeezes. If you don't have that information, you can't identify them. And we'll talk about that towards the end too. So, like I said, everything is from the options dealer's perspective, and gamma squeezes are essentially just hedging gone crazy. So let's take a look at hedging. Suppose we have an options dealer out there and they have a combined total of 100 delta. So between all the puts that they've sold and purchased and calls that they've sold and purchased, if you add up all the deltas, you get a net delta of 100. Well, this is equivalent to 10,000 share equivalents, right? Yeah, 10,000. Because each delta, or because each option is representative of 100 shares, if you multiply the net delta by 100, that gives you the share equivalents. And so when an options dealer delta hedges or tries to make their delta neutral to the market, they calculate their share equivalents. And so he essentially has 10,000 long shares that the option dealer has to neutralize. Well, how do you neutralize long shares? You short them. So the options dealer would short 10,000 shares. So he takes on his 100 delta, calculates his share equivalents. I have 10,000 shares equivalents in my books from transacting these options trades. So I'm going to neutralize this by selling 10,000 shares. Suppose the delta increases. We don't really know if the stock price increases or decreases in here, but typically we'll say the stock price rises. So the options dealer's delta increases by 50 points. So now he has 150 positive delta. This is now 15,000 shares equivalents that he has. So now he must sell 5,000 shares because he has 5,000 more long delta that he's acquired. He must offload that long delta by shorting the shares, because remember, each share is equivalent to 1 delta. Conversely, suppose the options dealer starts out with negative 100 net delta. well, then he would have negative 10,000 share equivalents, which means he would have to neutralize this by purchasing 10,000 shares. Because he has 10,000 short share equivalents, he has to neutralize that with 10,000 long shares. And then suppose, again, the delta goes from negative 100 to negative 150. So that means he now has negative 15,000 share equivalents. And that gives us, again, 5,000 shares that he must purchase. This is a good time to pause and kind of digest the idea that if you don't know the direction of the delta that the options dealer has, it's a coin flip on whether or not you are anticipating that the options dealer purchases or sells these shares in order to hedge their positions. Another fun fact is that the majority of calls in the stock market are retail short or dealer long, so they provide long delta to the options dealer. And in most cases, the majority of puts are retail long or dealer short, so they also provide long delta to the stock market. So if you let that cook for a minute, you'll realize that an options dealer always sells shares when the stock price increases. Not always, but in the majority of cases outside of gamma squeezes. And when the stock price falls, the options dealer will always purchase shares. And this is a really stabilizing force in the market because the options dealer then kind of always acts as this passive buyer. Whenever the stock price starts to fall, the options dealer just starts buying shares, which tends to be pretty good, right? Like, at least you have someone buying shares when the stock is falling, right? Help cushion the blow a little bit. But keep that in mind. You have to know the direction of delta in order to be able to understand hedging, and especially to be able to identify gamma squeezes. Super important. Let's look at a different example. Suppose I start with the options dealer starts with negative 100 delta. So as we've seen, that's negative 10,000 shares. Again, we want to neutralize, so we go ahead and we purchase 10,000 shares from the market. Remember that another caveat is the options dealers don't care about the price per se. They're just purchasing and selling shares to neutralize their portfolio, not necessarily to make a profit from the shares themselves. That's why they make good passive buyers and sellers. But let's suppose this time my delta increases, right? So instead of negative 100, I now have negative 50. Well, this is a negative 5,000 share equivalents, which means I have 50 more long delta, or 5,000 more, or 5,000 less short shares. So because I have 5,000 less short shares to hedge, I sell 5,000 shares. Yeah, because I have less delta exposure. Sorry, that's where it gets super confusing sometimes. So because I have less delta exposure, I don't need to buy as many shares. I don't need to have this stockpile of 10,000 shares. So because my delta exposure is halved, I can go ahead and toss that half of the shares that I purchased in order to hedge back into the market. I can sell those 5,000 shares that I'm no longer exposed to. See, delta can get really fun sometimes. So let's recap. Hi, Sally. Suppose Sally and me, we purchased a whole bunch of options, right? And they all have a whole bunch of delta, and that delta is dependent on the probability. That options dealer who took the opposite sides of all these options trades is going to delta hedge. And as that delta changes, these shares that the options dealer has to buy and sell is going to change. And it's that change in delta that is gamma, right? So an increase in long delta always results in selling from the options dealer. As the options dealer acquires more delta share equivalents, they have to offload those shares to the market. If the options dealer experiences an increase in short delta, essentially I see it as like a hole, like a short delta forms a hole that now the options dealer has to fill by purchasing shares. Versus if you have long delta, you kind of like a mountain of delta, and you have to make it level again, so you sell shares to the market. That's kind of how I see it, at least. And so what we see is that increase in long delta leading to selling. And so what is it? So when does a gamma squeeze come into place, right? So a gamma squeeze is when a stock price falls, which results in an increase in long delta, which promotes selling. So as the stock price falls, that increase in long delta causes the options dealer to sell more. So now we have selling into a falling stock price. And then with a increase in short delta, if this occurs when the stock price is rising, well then as the short delta, as that hole gets deeper and deeper and deeper, as the stock price rises, that hole has to be filled with purchasing shares. So now the options dealer is purchasing shares as the stock price is rising, which is creating this like positive feedback loop where the change in delta is causing the change in price, which is causing a greater change in delta. And that change in delta, or how much that delta is changing, is mitigated by gamma. Does that make sense? I hope. So let's go over it again. If the options dealer experiences an increase in long delta when the stock price falls, that increase in long delta has to be hedged by selling shares to the market. This means that the options dealer is going to sell shares, oftentimes significant amounts, into the market as the stock price falls. Conversely, if as the stock price rises, the options dealer experiences an increase in short delta, then the options dealer has to start purchasing shares. So that means he's now purchasing shares as the stock price is increasing. This creates this feedback loop where as the stock price rises, the options dealer purchases more shares, which drives the price up higher. So then he has to purchase more shares again. And this feedback loop is mitigated by gamma, or like the strength of the feedback loop. And this is a gamma squeeze in a nutshell. And again, this is why it's so important to know the delta direction, because without it, you don't know if the options dealer is going to purchase or sell shares in response to this price action. And like we said before, the main offenders here are dealer short calls because they give negative delta, and dealer long puts because, again, they give negative delta. And we're not even going to scratch the surface on how volatility starts playing into this. It gets pretty wild, honestly. That'll be in the future videos when we dive pretty deep into gamma squeezes. So let's look at an example. Suppose we have some stock ABC, and we have our options dealer here, and he's trading and selling options left and right. And suppose he has long puts. They have a delta of 0.75, and he has about 300 of them on his books. Suppose he then also has some short calls, and they have a delta of about 0.8, and he has about 500 of those on his books as well. Then suppose he has some long calls, and they have a delta of 0.8, and he has about 100 of them. So this gives him a total delta share equivalence of negative 47,000 shares. So what does he have to do? He has to purchase 47,000 shares from the market to become neutral. But suppose the stock price increases. Because the stock price increases, some deltas change. The puts become 0.65 delta. The short calls become 1.00 long delta, or short delta, sorry. And then those long calls increase modestly to 0.85. This now gives the options dealer a net delta of negative 54,500 share equivalents. So as the stock price increased and the options dealer has more short delta, he now has to purchase more long delta from the market. So he has to purchase 7,500 shares from the market. Well, this increase in price has led to purchasing behavior on the options dealer, so we're officially in a gamma squeeze. These 7,500 shares may be the passive bid required to keep driving the price up and up and up. And honestly, it's that simple. But it's only that simple if you know the direction of the delta that the options dealer has. And that's gamma squeezes. Today we talked about delta. We talked about how we can eyeball delta's change if we can conceptualize that delta is the probability of an option expiring in the money. Don't forget that an options dealer and the retail investor will always have equal but opposite delta. So that direction between the two is different. And then we talked about how gamma is this change in the exposure to delta, or that change in delta, which determines how many shares must be purchased or sold. But it's the direction of the delta that tells us if those shares have to be purchased or sold. So gamma tells us how much, delta tells us in which direction. And then we looked at an example of gamma squeezes, and we found that really it just comes to finding out if an options dealer has more short delta or more long delta as the stock price changes. I hope this helped, and yeah, I hope this helped. If you liked it, please leave a comment. Let me know how I did. What if I can change anything, make anything better. I'm definitely planning on making more videos on gamma squeezes later. Like I said, it's this nut that not a lot of people seem to have cracked in the market, and I want to crack it for you. I want to make some videos on them. So yeah, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.